Okay, everybody, it's a little past 4. I think I'm going to go ahead and get started for today. It is Thursday, March 18th. This is Civil Engineering 481, Transportation Engineering. And today we're going to move into a new chapter, Chapter 6. Before we get started, I guess first of all, I'll say go Aztecs. I'm hoping that when we get back together next week, the Aztecs will have won 2 games in the tournament and we'll be continuing on, hopefully. We'll see how that goes this weekend. And then just a reminder that I gave everybody until tomorrow to turn in the Chapter 5 homework. I figured since a couple of the problems, like half the homework was really focused on the material we covered on Tuesday, I wanted to give you another day if you need it. Obviously, you can turn it in early if you want. So I'm asking for it to be turned in. I adjusted the due date in Canvas to tomorrow at 4 o'clock, Friday at 4 o'clock. And I'll be grading the homework over the weekend. So just a reminder about that. I sent an announcement out about that after class on Tuesday. So any questions before I get started on Chapter 6? Okay, let me go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen today. There we go. My full screen. And what I have here is I have my slides for Chapter 6, and I also have another document that I have posted in course documents, which are the key equations. There's a lot of equations in Chapter 6, and a bunch of them you see here are listed under freeway segment equations. Then there's multi-lane highway segment equations, and then I also put in the nomenclature, so you've got all these defined terms. So I did that again. Chapter 6 is pretty heavy on equations, none of which are going to be expected to memorize, obviously. So anyway, I put them over here so we can refer to them as we go through. So just to start out, Chapter 6, I consider a pretty important chapter in this course because it's really related, as it says here, it's related to the Highway Capacity Manual. And the Highway Capacity Manual is one of the more classic guidance documents in highway design that's been around. And the first version of it, actually, when I think it was still called Transportation Engineering at San Diego State back in, I probably took the class in 1982. I think the only textbook we had was a copy of the Highway Capacity Manual, as I recall. And what I remember about it it was just a standard plain white book. It was a bound paperback book, fairly sizable, and it had just a plain white cover with just stark kind of black text on it saying Highway Capacity Manual. But the thing about it was in the early 1980s, it was still like the 1964 version of the Highway Capacity Manual. It came out in the early 1960s, and maybe there was an earlier version, but this one was around for 20 years. And it really was born out of the interstate era, when all the interstate freeways were built. And so it was heavily focused on freeways, but not just freeways. And as you can even see, as it says here, multi-lane highways and so forth. But anyway, it's such, and then when I started in Caltrans in 1985, I'm pretty sure that was the year the first major update was done to the Highway Capacity Manual, and they changed it from a bound book into a notebook with loose leaf pages in it. This is long before the internet, and so that it wasn't electronic. It was an actual manual. So in any event, it's always been used. And as you'll see in the slides, the equation numbers, I think you'll even see over here on the side, there's a couple of these where it says equation 12.1 from the HCM, which is the Highway Capacity Manual equation number. But the easiest way for you to find these equations is the equations numbers from your book. So all the equations that we're dealing with in chapter 6 start with a 6, 1 through 610 and beyond. So in any event, the concepts that we're going to talk about in chapter 6 is all about how to properly or how to go about sizing facilities, whether they're freeways or multi-lane highways. And if you're given an expected traffic volume, you can evaluate based on the configuration that you assume how well the traffic will operate, or you can decide how well you want the traffic to operate, and then you can design the system to match that, what we'll call level of service, and we'll get into that. And so highway capacity is a very, very important concept in highway design and traffic analysis. So some of the concepts in chapter 6 are really important and basic to the field of transportation engineering for sure. So anyway, I just thought I'd start out by mentioning that. And the chapter really covers 3 major areas: freeway segments, evaluating freeway segments, evaluating multi-lane highways. So technically freeways are multi-lane highways, but freeways are different, right? And multi-lane highways have different characteristics where we'll talk about. And then 2-lane highways. There's a section, a fairly sizable section in your book on 2-lane highways. I'm not going to spend too much time on 2-lane highways other than a couple of basic concepts that I think are important for you to be familiar with. Earlier on in the class, if you recall, I kind of touched on the passing site distance. There was most of the site distance, was stopping site distance, right? But for 2-lane highways, there's also passing site distance, and I spent a little time, and I'll do kind of the same thing next Tuesday when I cover multi-lane highways. I'll also spend a little bit of time on 2-lane highways, but the major portions of this chapter are focusing on the freeway segments and the multi-lane highways, and there's differences between them. And we're going to go over the freeway segment analysis today, and then on Tuesday we'll go over multi-lane, and you'll see the differences between them. So in any event, let me do something real quick here. Bothers me. Okay. All right. So let's get started on the freeway. So freeways. Freeways are divided highways with full control of access and 2 or more lanes for traffic in each direction. Okay, just in terms of a definition of what freeways are. Full control of access means there are no driveways that are cut into a freeway. There are no signals that are directly on the freeway. They're at the ramps, but not on the freeway itself. And that means the access to the facility is completely controlled. About the only kind of driveway that you'll see that connects into a freeway might be like a maintenance facility that is directly off the freeway, or there's an example on Interstate 5, just north of Mission Bay on what would that be, the southbound side of 5, where there's a driveway that goes to an SDG&E substation that happens to be right adjacent to the freeway right-of-way. That's pretty rare. As a matter of fact, it's really rare that that freeway right-of-way and utility right-of-way share access like that, but sometimes it's hard to do it any other way, and so that's the case. But basically, freeways have full control of access. Freeways are uninterrupted flow. I mean, By that, it means, no signalized or stop controlled at grade intersections, and direct access is not permitted. When you say uninterrupted flow, you might be like, yeah, well, what about when, at rush hour when there's congestion? That's interrupted flow, of course, but in general, freeways, let's just say freeways at 3 a.m. if there's no construction going on, freeways provide uninterrupted flow if you kind of ignore, congestion levels. And then the access to the freeways are limited to ramp locations, okay? And opposing directions of flow are continuously separated by a raised barrier, an at-grade median, or a raised traffic island. So that's the other thing about freeways is the opposing directions are separated. But I will tell you this, there are, when it says an at-grade median there, which I have highlighted, if you go out like just outside of the main metro area of San Diego, for example, if you drive out east on Interstate 8 or north on 15 as you get, between Escondido and Temecula maybe, there are, the median is wide enough that there isn't necessarily a barrier in the median. It's just an extra wide median. So sometimes you don't have an actual barrier, whereas in the metro area, almost every freeway has a barrier of some sort in the median to separate opposing traffic, just because usually in the metro areas, you don't have unlimited, you don't have the kind of room or right of way to provide a very wide median. And there are all kinds of, design parameters as to when you have to use a barrier and when you don't. So, what we're going to be looking at is the operating conditions of freeways, and those are based on, again, all these cars are being, we're assuming here we're talking about freeways with human beings operating the vehicles. We've talked a little bit about autonomous vehicles and how that may be coming in the future, but we're mainly, chapter 6 really is all about, operating freeways where you have human beings driving the vehicles. So it's the interaction among vehicles and drivers and the geometric characteristics of the freeway. And we'll get into that, what some of those geometric characteristics are. So the operations can also on freeways can be affected by environmental conditions. Obviously, if it's raining, any of you who have lived or live in other areas that have more inclement weather than San Diego, I think many of you, and when you go to wherever it is you come from, and and people drive in bad weather conditions all the time, they're generally better at it than here in San Diego. If we get a little rain on, here, drivers get a little crazy because they're not used to it. They're used to driving in conditions like it is right now, sunny and beautiful. Lighting conditions can affect freeway operations. Pavement conditions, if the pavement is, well, and then pavement can be related to weather. The first rain after many months of no rain, the oils in the pavement come to the surface and it's slicker than normal. And then finally, incidents, traffic incidents, accidents, stalled vehicles, anything that is unusual that impedes the flow of traffic. So there are 3 components of freeways that we're interested in, evaluating. The first is basic freeway segments. So those are the segments of the freeways, and as it says, not really influenced by ramps or weaving areas, which I'll describe in just a second. But basically, the longer stretches of freeways in between the interchanges where the vehicles are flowing. Then weaving areas are segments of the freeway, and I think weaving. I like the term weaving because I think most of us as drivers understand what that means right away, right? Because we've all dealt with it, and it's where 2 or more vehicle flows have to cross each other's path along the length of a freeway. So if you're in the right-hand lane on a freeway and the interchanges, the on-ramp and the off-ramp are spaced fairly closely, you've got vehicles jockeying for position or weaving back and forth through that right lane, some of them trying to get on the freeway and some of them trying to get off. So as it says here, it's usually formed when an on-ramp is followed by an off-ramp, and the two are connected maybe by an auxiliary lane. There might be an extra lane to allow for the weaving moves to make. And then merge and diverge areas, those are the points where on and off ramps join the freeway. The junction at that point is an area of, as they say here, an area of turbulence because you've got vehicles flowing in different directions. And just a word of caution or safety, every now and then, when you look at, in particular, an off-ramp, and as the ramp moves and diverges away from the main freeway lanes, the area in between the main freeway lanes and the ramp is often called the gore of the ramp, where the two come together. And every now and then I see people pulling over their vehicle into the gore area of a ramp, whether it's because, who knows, even if the vehicle's experiencing problems, or maybe somebody's just pulled over to take a call or whatever. That is probably the worst place you can possibly pull your vehicle over on a freeway, because it's a decision point. And I think we've all seen people make last-second decisions to either decide to exit, or a vehicle's exiting and decide they don't want to exit, and then they drive through that gore point. So it's not a very safe place to be. So the basic freeway segments. This is just a really high-level sketch of an interchange, freeway to freeway interchange here, and then there's interchanges at local streets that surround it. Then the basic freeway segment is the section of freeway that's in between the ramps that are tying in at the local streets. So the way we measure performance of freeways is through three things. Density, which we've defined previously in terms of passenger cars per mile per lane, because we're talking about freeways. Freeways by definition it's very rare to have a freeway with just two lanes, one lane in each direction. Extremely rare. If you find a two-lane freeway like that, it probably is maybe temporary in nature, or it might be in a super rural area. But even then, there's no passing opportunities and so forth. It's very rare to see a freeway that is less than 4 lanes, 2 lanes in each direction. So anyway, density is in terms of passenger cars per mile per lane, speed in terms of mean passenger car speed, and volume to capacity ratio. These are the 3 things. And so these measures, kind of tell you how well or poorly, as it says here, traffic is flowing on that particular freeway segment. Although speed, as it says here, speed is an important indicator of service to drivers, freedom to maneuver and the proximity to other vehicles are also important to drivers. Just think about yourself when you're driving. If you're driving and there are just tons of cars in the lanes next to you, in front of you, behind you, the spacing is kind of closer than you feel comfortable, and you're kind of, in a sense, you feel like you're really surrounded by a lot of other traffic. That can have an impact on your driving, and it tends, when that happens, drivers tend to slow down because they get, for lack of a better description, they get a little nervous about driving under those conditions. And so that kind of relates to the concept of density. The more dense the traffic stream is, the more impact there's going to be on the speed of the traffic and the flow of the traffic. So, and as it says here, density increases as flow increases up to capacity. So what this leads to is the concept of level of service. Maybe many of you have heard of this before. Maybe some of you haven't heard of this concept of level of service, or LOS. Level of service is really directly related. This is section 6.2. I believe this is table 6.2, if I remember correctly from the book. But you can see that level of service is directly related to density and in passenger cars per mile per lane. So you can see here, level of service, if the level of service A is lower density and level of service F is higher density, okay? And in essence, level of service F means that the demand for use of that particular segment of the freeway exceeds its capacity, okay? So it's stop and go traffic. And so the density levels you see is for a level of service A, which is basically free flow with no impedance whatsoever, is a density of 11 or less. And then you can see level of service B is still fairly good flow, and actually level of service C is good flow on a freeway. And you can see how the densities move up. When you get to level of service D, you start getting some levels of congestion and so forth. Level of service E is very unstable. It's almost at capacity. It's just under capacity. And then level of service F is just that. So this is a kind of a classic set of photos. These are in your book, I believe, and they're in the highway capacity manual, but just a general representation of level of service A is just, basically, very, very light traffic. This vehicle right here isn't feeling any kind of concern or uncertainty or nervousness about how many vehicles are surrounding them on the roadway. And then you go to level of service B, even C looks pretty good. But level of service D, you can see, there's a few more cars around. You got to pay it, a little bit. And level of service E, it's starting to get pretty, it's moving, but it's starting to get full. And all it takes is one little thing to cause a problem. And then level of service F, this is basically stop and go traffic here. So there are ways to measure the level of service and the quality of the capacity calculations of freeway segments. And we're going to go through the equations. Ultimately, what you're getting to is a calculation of the density of the freeway segment, so that then you can match that up to the table for the levels of service, so that you can determine the level of service, or you can calculate a volume and then determine whether that volume can be handled by, say, the number of lanes that you're going to plan for your freeway segment. So you'll see as we go through here. So the first few equations that I have listed over here to the right in this here are the speed and flow relationships. So you'll see there's a figure that shows this breaking point for the flow rate. But if your flow rate is below the breaking point, then the speed that you use in your calculations just equals the free flow speed. Basically, if you're below the breaking point, that means that you're definitely at a level of service that is not impeding the flow of traffic. On the other hand, if your flow rate exceeds the break point, and we'll go through some of these calculations to help you understand this better, then you have to calculate the speed that will be used in your density calculation through this equation 6.2, where you have to, in essence, modify the free flow speed through this equation here. And again, this comes from the Highway Capacity Manual with years and years of empirical studies and so forth to show how these relationships work. And so as you can see, the one term they don't define on this slide here is FFS, and that's your free flow speed. So the bottom line here, excuse me. So when you use this equation here, there's a couple of new values that are introduced. C is the capacity in passenger cars per hour per lane, and then the BP is the breaking point, or the linear to curvilinear flow rate break point in passenger cars per hour per lane. And so this is the equation that helps you calculate the capacity. Here, using this, if your free flow speed is between 55 and 75 miles per hour, and then your breaking point equation that you use if your free flow speed is between 55 and 75 miles per hour. So again, we'll go through some problems that you see here, but these are important equations to be able to evaluate to calculate your speed, which will be used ultimately in a density calculation so that you can determine what your level of service is. So this is figure 6.2. This is important. It shows the relationship between speed and flow rate. And you have the free flow speed levels here on this, on each of these lines. And then you've got these areas here at the dashed line representing level of service A, B, C, D, E, and F, and you can see that the level of service calculations are based on density calculations here. 11 passenger cars per mile per lane, 18, 26, 35, and 45. That relates back to that table that we went over. And then this figure is also represented in tabular form in table 6.2. So when you work your problems in this chapter, you can use the figure based on the information you have from your problem. You can look up, if you've got a free flow speed of 65 miles per hour and your flow rate is, let's say, 1800. So you go 65 miles an hour and you find 1800 is going to be right about here, and your 65 mile an hour line. So right around in here, which means that you're going to be operating at level of service D. You can see you're in the level of service D range. Just as an example, you can do the same thing by going to this table, and you can go 65 miles an hour and your flow rate of, what did I say it was, 1800. I think I said, 1800 was your flow rate. Well, it's over the maximum. It's 1800 is over 1665. So it's not level of service D. It's under 2060. So you're at level of service D. It's basically just this graph in tabular form, and either one is fine to use for solving your problems. And on the exams, I generally provide both as an attachment, the table and the figure. You can decide which one you want to use. You can, obviously you in the figure, you have to do a little bit of estimating. In the table, you might need to interpolate if you need, depending on what you have in your problems. So how do you go about doing the analysis procedure for freeway segments? You have to specify the input data, just like every problem, of course. And then the first thing you do is you have to figure out what your free flow speed is. And then you need to consider capacity, and then calculate your analysis flow rate. And then you estimate your speed and density. And finally, from that density, you can determine what your level of service is. So we're going to go through all of this. This is just the basic. And then this is also important too, when the equations that we're going to go over, basically, there are factors that actually reduce the speed based on things that that have an impact on speed, but it's all based off of certain base conditions. And so the base conditions for freeways assume that lane widths are 12 feet, and the vast majority of freeway lanes that you'll find out there are 12 feet wide. There are some segments that have maybe 11 feet. Pretty rare to find 10-foot lanes on a freeway, maybe in a really highly urbanized area where the right-of-way is very restricted, but generally. So then the minimum right shoulder lateral clearance between the edge of the traveled way and the nearest obstacle is 6 feet, and a minimum lateral clearance in the median is 2. So the bottom line is, if you're dealing with lanes that are less than 12 feet, or you're dealing with a lateral clearance of less than 6 feet on the right side, then you're going to have to modify your speed calculations downward because if you do have narrow lanes or you do have limited lateral clearance, it tends to slow drivers down. That's basically what you'll find as we go through this. The traffic stream, the assumption is that there's just passenger cars only in the traffic stream, not trucks, and we'll talk about how we deal with trucks. There are no on or off ramps within 3 miles upstream or 3 miles downstream of the segment midpoint. So in other words, you've got a very long section of freeway that is not being influenced by any ramps. The terrain is level with no grades greater than 2%. So there's nothing affecting traffic that way, because if you get over 2%, that's going to have an impact on your trucks and slow traffic down. And then the driver population is dominated by familiar users. I think we've all seen this. I live up in North County, inland in the Rancho Penasquitos area. When I drive Interstate 15 on a weekday anywhere near rush hour, drivers are generally just really, they're driving along, everybody drives along. It's like a much smoother ride in a way if it's not congested, because everybody's very familiar. When you drive that same stretch of freeway on the weekend, you get a lot of drivers there that don't drive it every day, and they're looking at the signs, they're slowing down to make sure they get to the right exit or whatever. And so that's a typical kind of driver behavior that we find. So anyway, just a few photos to show what we're talking about. Like this is very narrow lateral clearance here. On the right hand side, you can see there's a barrier just to the right of the traffic on both sides here, and then there's virtually no clearance from the center barrier. So these vehicles feel like they're locked in pretty tight, versus this side where you've got a shoulder on the right and you've got some clearance in the median as well. So these vehicles generally are going to feel a little bit more free flowing than these vehicles over here. Heavy vehicles, this is just an example, like especially on this photo, I think this is a good photo. It says large gaps form in front of trucks. This is very typical that, when you have large trucks, that there's gaps in front of them in the traffic because they're slower moving than the regular vehicles. So free flow speed is a concept that we're going to use in the analysis of freeway segments. It's the mean speed of passenger cars measured under low to moderate flow rates. In other words, you don't have to be at level of service A, that first photo that I showed you where there's like hardly any cars at all, but you don't want to be at level of service E either, where, there's a lot more cars, and cars, all it'll take is, somebody flashing a sign or something that will cause the vehicle flow to break down. And so it says there's 2 methods to determine free flow speed. You can get it by field measurement or by estimation with the guidelines provided through the HCM is the Highway Capacity Manual. I think I've already defined it, but just a reminder that when you see HCM, that's what it's referring to. So the free flow speed, you might be working a problem where it says the free flow speed is X, assuming that it's actually field measured. But there's other ways of defining the free flow speed, which we will go through. So estimating the free flow speed, and that's mostly what we're going to be doing in this chapter, or in this section on freeways, is, you know, you adjust the base free flow speed downward to reflect the influence of three factors that we just kind of showed you or talked about previously. But the three factors are lane width, lateral clearance, and ramp density. Okay, all three of these things will have an effect on the free flow speed. Okay, narrower lanes, lesser lateral clearance, and more ramps that have an influence, will have an influence on the flow and will generally cause the free flow speed to drop. So this is a very important equation, one that you will definitely be using. You can see it comes right out of the highway capacity manual, equation 12.2, but it's equation 6.6 in your book. And this is something that's been developed over many, many years of analysis and empirical observations, et cetera. So the free flow speed is equal to, the base free flow speed in miles per hour is 75.4. Again, kind of an empirical number that was, I mean, this is what you'll use for calculations. I mean, there are places in this country, where was I, in Utah? I think the speed limit's 80 miles per hour, I think there's a couple of places in the country where you actually have speed limits that are higher than this base free flow speed. But this is the equation, this is what you'll use. And then there's a factor, an adjustment factor for lane width, the FLW, and we'll go through these. And then you have an adjustment factor for the right shoulder lateral clearance. And then you've got an adjustment factor for the total, this TRD refers to total ramp density. And all of these things are adjustments. You assume that you start at this miles per hour here. Based on these adjustments, you're going to end up with a free flow speed of something less than 75.4. So let's go through it. The first adjustment factor is lane width. It's very simple. It's table 6.3 in your book, and it basically says, if you've got a lane width of 12 on your freeway, you don't have to adjust it at all. The adjustment's 0. And remember, if you go back to the equation, that means you're just subtracting 0, so it doesn't have any effect. However, if you have 11-foot lanes on your freeway, you need to adjust it by, you need to reduce the free flow speed by 1.9 miles per hour. And if you have 10-foot lanes, and as I was telling you, certainly in California, 10-foot freeway lanes are pretty rare. You have to adjust that by 6.6 miles per hour. Not an insignificant, this is, you know, almost a 10% reduction in speed because of the lane width. Then you've got the lateral clearance factor. And so the reduction in miles per hour is dependent on what the actual lateral clearance is and how many lanes you have in one direction. So obviously, if your lateral clearance is more than 6 feet, it doesn't matter how many lanes you have, there's no adjustment. On the other hand, if your lateral clearance is only, on the right-hand side, is only 2 feet, you have to adjust by 2.4 if there's just 2 freeway lanes in one direction, by 1.6 if there's 3, by 0.8 if there's 4, and so on. So you can take a look at this table. Again, a pretty simple, you know, to be able to take a look and apply this factor. And then the total ramp density is really a matter of just adding up the number of on and off ramps in one direction within 3 miles upstream and 3 miles downstream. And then you divide it by the 6 miles so that you end up with the number of ramps per mile. So let's just say that there's 3 ramps 3 miles upstream and 3 ramps 3 miles downstream. You divide that by 6 and your total ramp density is 1.0, right? You've got a total of 6 ramps in 6 miles, just as an example. So what you want to do is you need to calculate your analysis flow rate. And you'll see I've got a lot of these equations. They're listed over here. They're highlighted because these are the things that you're going to need to use to do your calculations. And so The this V sub P is the 15-minute passenger car equivalent flow rate in passenger cars per hour per lane. And then V is the hourly volume in vehicles per hour, which is oftentimes a given. Or you might need to calculate that. That might be the problem, is asking you to figure out what the volume should be, but oftentimes it's given. The peak hour factor, and we'll define these terms, you'll see how to calculate the peak hour factor in a second. N is the number of lanes in one direction, not in two. If it's a 4-lane freeway, N would be 2, because we're talking about traffic flow, which is directional, okay? And then finally, there's going to be a heavy vehicle adjustment factor. And so let's go through that. Now, the peak hour factor, this figure right here, is equal to that hourly volume divided by the maximum 15-minute volume within the hour times 4. And so, and the reason this is done is to just give an idea of, sometimes, the hourly figure is a little misleading, because it's not necessarily that the traffic flows at the same level throughout the hour. There can be a 15-minute period within that hour that is that carries much more traffic. So that's why you do this calculation. And then there's a concept that we use called passenger car equivalency, or PCE. It's a factor that's used because you need to account for a traffic mix. Trucks and buses and RVs can have an impact on the flow of traffic. We all know that. You see it when you're out on the freeway, that the more trucks, buses, and RVs that are on the lanes, they can have an impact on how well the traffic flows. So you, and particularly if you've got steep grades on your freeways, or steeper grades, that can have an impact. So there's 2 different ways to account for this, and we'll do a problem with both of these. One is what they call extended general freeway segments, which are described as either that are rolling terrain, or hold on a second. Level. I couldn't think of the word level. Sorry about that. So extended general freeway segments are either level terrain or rolling terrain, and they're dealt with that way. Or once you get into steeper grades, there's more specific tables and data that you have to kind of apply, given the type and the mix of trucks and the length of the grade and the steepness of the grade. All of those can have an impact on this factor that you'll see when we start doing the calculations. So extended general freeway lanes, it's like, this is where there's, there's a number of upgrades, downgrades, and level segments. And you can use these when no one grade is long enough or steep enough to have a significant effect on the overall operation of the segment. And so the guideline is the extended general segment analysis can be used where none of the grades of 3% or greater is longer than a quarter mile. In other words, if you've got a grade of 3% or more and it's less than a quarter mile, generally trucks can negotiate it pretty reasonably. It's the long sustained grades that cause the problem. And so when there's no one grade of less than 3%, that's longer than a half mile. So when you get, basically what it's saying here is if you've got a grade, even a lower level grade uphill, that's more than a half mile long sustained, that can have an impact on traffic and on the larger vehicles. And this is where it says whenever extended general segment analysis is used, the terrain must be classified as either level or rolling, and that's usually a given in the problem, whether it's level or rolling. I couldn't remember that word level, that's weird. Anyway, So level terrain, any combination of grades and horizontal vertical alignment that permits heavy vehicles to maintain the same speed as passenger cars is classified as level terrain. Generally, short grades of no more than 2%. That's considered level. Rolling terrain is that heavy vehicles could reduce their speeds substantially below those of passenger cars, but it does not cause the heavy vehicles to operate at crawl speeds for any significant length of time. So in other words, rolling terrain is going to have an impact on the larger vehicles, but not a really substantial one like some of the longer and steeper grades, which are, you know, we've all driven on freeways where you've seen trucks that are just like literally, they're barely moving, okay? So if you do have an extended general freeway segment, table 6.5 is super easy. If it's level terrain, the E sub T is equal to 2. If it's rolling terrain, it's equal to 3, and you'll put it in to an equation that I'll show you here in a moment, okay? So specific grades are different. Then you have to actually get into some tables, tables 6.6, 6.7, and 6.8, where you have to determine the passenger car equivalent values for the larger vehicles that are going to be occurring on that segment. And this is what those tables look like. Again, right out of the highway capacity manual, but you can see up here, these are passenger car equivalents, the E sub T, for heavy vehicles. And this is a mix, this table is for a mix of approximately 30% single unit trailers and 70% tractor trailers on specific grades. So in other words, pretty heavily focused on tractor trailer trucks. And so you've got the grades over here, you've got the length in miles, and then you have this column refers to the percentage of heavy vehicles. And again, in your problem, this will be given to you. They'll say that you've got a grade of 3.5% and it's 1.25 miles long, and you've got 15% trucks. So you come over here and you look and you see that your factor is 2.82. Then there's another table. I actually just clicked. See, I'm going from slide 31 to slide 32. Here, it's the same thing, except that the mix of trucks is different. The single unit trailers are 50% and 50% tractor trailers. And then finally, table 6.8, which is the next slide here, 33. This one has a heavier percentage of single unit trailers versus tractor trailers. And so when you have to really look at your problem and determine what it is, what the grade is, what the length of the grade is, what's the total percentage of heavy vehicles, so that you can find the appropriate factor. So an average grade technique can be used for composite grades, or all subsection grades are less than 4%, or the total length of the composite grade is less than 4,000 feet. So the bottom line is the problem will dictate how you apply that factor in. And so the heavy vehicle factor that goes into the equation is this equation here, 6.9. And so what you have here, the two things, the E sub T is the passenger car equivalency for heavy vehicles that you either get out, it's either rolling or level, if that's appropriate, or you get it out of one of those three tables based on the information you were given in the problem. And then P sub T is just the proportion of heavy vehicles in the traffic stream. And once again, that's usually given in the problem, the number of total. And it's usually in terms of, they might even tell you how much are single unit and how many are tractor trailer. P sub T is the total of both, the percentage of both. So if they give you, you know, that there's and many times they just give you the percentage of trucks on the, in total. They don't even break it down between the two, and that's what you use here. And so you do this calculation, you put it into your equation, which is the equation back here. Let me find it. This equation here, this is, what equation is that? That's Equation 6.6 over here on the right, free flow speed equals 75.4 minus the lane width adjustment, the right lateral clearance adjustment, and the total ramp density adjustment. And so then when you're calculating your flow, you need to use equation 6.7, 6.8, and 6.9 ultimately to be able to calculate your flow. And what you're trying to get to at the tail end of all of this is equation 6.610, which is your density calculation, which is your flow rate divided by your average passenger speed. So this is either your free flow speed or the speed if free flow speed is not what you use here, and we'll go over that in a couple of problems now. But this is the final equation that we have in the freeway segment. And so what I want to do now is to do a couple of problems, and I think it'll make it very clear how all of these different equations are applied. So before I go on to the examples, the first one being example 6.1, does anybody have any questions on any of the material I've covered so far? Okay, I don't see anything in the chat. So, okay. So this will start making a lot more sense once we go through a couple of examples. So the first one, 6.1, is a 6-lane urban freeway. So that means 3 lanes in each direction, is on level terrain. There you go. You now know that this problem, you are not going to need to worry about those specific grades, right? It's just telling you that it's on level terrain. But it's also telling you it has 11-foot lanes, and there are obstructions 2 feet from the right edge of the traveled pavement. So you know that both of those things are important, right, in terms of modifying your free flow speed. And there are 9 ramps within 3 miles upstream and 3 miles downstream of the midpoint of the analysis segment. So, okay, so you've got 9 ramps. And remember, however many ramps you have to divide it by 6 miles, right? Because there's 3 miles upstream, 3 miles downstream. So 9 divided by 6, you're going to end up with that factor is going to be 1.5, right? 9/6. So then it tells you a directional weekday peak period volume of 3,000 vehicles is observed, okay, with 810 vehicles arriving in the most congested 15-minute period. So they basically 3,000 is V, and 810 is V sub 15, right? So that's something to keep in mind as well. And then it says if the traffic stream has 10% single unit trucks and 10% tractor trailer trucks, determine the level of service. Now, as I said, you didn't necessarily have to go into those tables, but you still need to understand what the percentage of trucks are in order to get the heavy vehicle adjustment. You'll see that as we go through the problem. So basically what this means is the traffic stream has a truck percentage of 20%. There's 10% single unit, 10% tractor. You add those two together, so P sub T equals 20%. So let's start working the problem. We use equation 6.6. Here it is, and 6.6 is the equation over here on the right. So I'm not going to go back to the actual tables, but if you go to table 6.3, you'll see that for 11-foot lanes, you need to put in an adjustment of 1.9 miles per hour. We went over those tables earlier. If you go into table 6.4 and you see that there are obstructions 2 feet from the right edge of a freeway with 3 lanes in each direction, you need to put in an adjustment of 1.6. And then, as I was mentioning before, the total ramp density, they told you there are 9 ramps in the 6 miles, 3 miles down and 3 miles upstream. So you take that 9, you divide it by 6, you get 1.5 ramps per mile. So you take all of these figures and put them into equation 6.6. Start with 75.4, you subtract 1.9, you subtract the 1.6, and then you take 3.22 times 1.5 to the 0.84. And, you know, honestly, that's why I'm saying this equation is based on years and years of freeway observation and so forth. And that's where it comes from, the highway design manual. So you do all of that, you subtract all of these factors, and you end up with a free flow speed. So the free flow speed isn't 75.4 miles per hour on this stretch of urban freeway. It's actually 67.4, which is not an insignificant difference. It's a slower speed because you've got some trucks out there, and you've got some obstructions, and you've got narrow lanes and a few ramps. So all of those things have an impact. So now you need to determine your flow rate with equation 6.7, okay? So the one thing they do over here, they kind of sneak it in over here. They calculate the peak hour factor, which is V, the total volume, divided by the 15-minute volume times 4. They didn't really throw that equation in here, which is equation 6.8. They kind of just shoved it over here to the side. But in any event, the peak hour factor is 0.926 if you do that calculation. Then N is 3. They told you there's 3 lanes in each direction. And then E sub T, if you go to table 6.5, remember they told you it was level terrain, so you don't have to look it up. I mean, you don't have to go through those tables. You basically just find it in there, and level terrain is 2.0. So now you go to equation 6.9 to get your heavy vehicle factor, which is 1 over 1 plus, this is P sub T here, which is 20%. They gave you the two 10% add to 20% for the percentage of trucks. And then the 2.0 is your E sub T over here. And when you do that calculation, you get 0.833. So now you can calculate your flow rate, 3,000 divided by the peak hour factor, 0.926, divided by 3, divided by 0.833, your heavy vehicle factor, and you end up with, they round it to 1,297 passenger cars per hour per lane, okay? So now that you know what VP is, you need to compare that to the breaking point. You remember this breaking point equation 6.4 here. So what you want to do is you want to put you want to put in the free flow speed that you calculated above into this equation and calculate it. So you do that, you put in the 67.4, everything else in this equation is given, the 1,000 plus 40 times 75 minus the free flow speed, and you end up with 1,304, okay? So because the flow rate that you calculated here, 1,297, is less than the breakpoint value of 1,304, that means that the speed S will be equal to the free flow speed. The S will only be different if your free flow speed is higher than the breakpoint. Then you're in that curvilinear part of the curve in that one figure. So 67.4, which we calculated up here, is what the free flow speed is. So now you want to go and use equation 610, which is your flow rate divided by your speed, which in this case is equal to the free flow speed. So you get your 1,297 divided by 67.4, and you end up with 19.2 as your density, passenger cars per mile per lane. So then you go back to that original table 2, and you say, if you've got a density of 19.2, what level of service does that equate to? Well, it turns out it's level of service C, because the maximum density for level of service B is 18, and the maximum density for level of service C is 26. So it falls in between the two of those. So this freeway segment operates at level of service C. And this last note down here notes that you can use figure 6.2 instead of table 6.2 to make this determination. You can just, you can use your density value and your flow rate on that figure and get to the same conclusion in terms of which level of service it is. So any questions on this first problem that I went over? Okay, now the example problem 6.2 is a good one to follow that up with, because example 6.2, it uses some of the same data, but it changes things a little bit such that you have to use those tables to look up your values for you have to use the tables to look up your values for the heavy vehicle factor, and it also your speed, your free flow speed exceeds your break point. Or excuse me, I said that wrong. Your flow exceeds the break point, and so you have to use this equation 6.2 in this problem. So it changes things a little bit. So I think it shows you the difference between the two of them. So the problem says, consider the freeway and conditions from the previous example that we just went over, 6.1. At some point further along the roadway, there's a 6% upgrade. That's 1.25 miles long. Now that's big. 6% is a very steep grade for a freeway, and it's over a mile long, so that's very long. Okay, all other characteristics are the same as in example 1. So what, under these conditions, what is the level of service? And then it also asks you how many vehicles can be added before the roadway reaches capacity, assuming that the proportion of vehicle types and peak hour factor remain constant. So we'll get to that, but let's focus on the first part, and which is to calculate our level of service. Then we'll go over that last part where we figure out the volume. So basically, the issue is the adjustment factors are all the same as in 6.1, example 6.1, except for the heavy vehicle factor, because you now have a long and steep grade. So you have to use the equivalency factors. So you go to the tables, you use table 6.7 because that's the 50-50 split between single unit trailers and tractor trailers. Remember, problem 6.1 said each of them were 10%, so that it was a 50-50 split between those. So that's table 6.7. And so what you do is you go in and you go into that table for 6%, 1.25 miles long. Both of those are listed in the table. I don't think you have to do any interpolation. And so basically when you do that, you look it up, the E sub T is 3.27. So you substitute that into equation 6.9. Remember, this 20% stays the same. Everything in the equation stays the same except for E sub T. I think it was 2 in problem 6.1. So when you do that, that changes the heavy vehicle factor, okay, and it's 0.688. So then when you redo your equation, the equation 6.7, 3,000 is the same, the peak hour factor is the same, the number of lanes is the same, but your heavy vehicle factor has changed now. And so what you end up with is a flow rate of 1,570. And in the previous problem, the flow rate was, what was the flow rate in the previous problem? 1,296. So yeah, I mean, it's gone up by almost 300 passenger cars per hour per lane. So now in this case, the flow rate of 1,570 is more than the BP value, because we calculated the breakpoint value in the previous problem, it was 1,304. So now it's more, and so therefore S won't equal the free flow speed. So you now need to use equation 6.2. And so to do that, you have to calculate the capacity first. This equation here, you take your free flow speed and put it in, and you calculate it, and you end up with a capacity of 2374. So you've got the capacity of 2374, and you've got the breakpoint value of 1304. So you put all of, and then you've got your flow of 1570. All of that goes into equation 6.2, which is over here. You put all of those figures in, You crank this one out and you end up with a speed of 66.5 miles per hour. So then you can do your density calculation. You've got your flow rate of 1570. You've got this new speed value, which you got out of equation 6.2, and it ends up with a density of 23.6 passenger cars per mile per lane. Now, it still gives you a level of service C, because the range for level of service C is between 18 and 26, okay? It's still level of service C, but traffic conditions are still worse on the upgrade section than the level section because the density is higher. In other words, you're moving up on that scale within the level of service C and moving closer to level of service D, which is a lesser, obviously a lesser level of service. So now the last part of this problem is kind of interesting. It says to determine how many vehicles can be added before the capacity is reached, the hourly volume at capacity must be computed. Recall that capacity corresponds to a volume to capacity ratio of 1, basically the threshold between level of service E and level of service F. So if you have a free flow speed of 67.4, the capacity is 2374. So then what you can do is you can use equation 6.7, this equation over here, the flow equation, to help. If you know what your flow rate has to be at capacity, and you know what the peak hour factor is, you know the number of lanes, you know your heavy vehicle factor, you can calculate the volume. So that's 4,537 vehicles per hour is basically how many vehicles you can have on this section before you hit capacity. And it does, and then they go on to say, you know, that the problem said that there was 3,000 vehicles in flow. And so you can actually accept about 1,500 more than that before you would actually be at capacity, because at 3,000, we determined that you're back in level of service C. So you have a lot of room to grow. And that's how you can use these calculations to help, you know, further your analysis and think, well, you know, if for some reason, you know, traffic were to grow over time, how much room do we have? How long do we have, or how much more traffic can be added before we need to think about adding and making this a full, you know, 8-lane freeway, 4 lanes in each direction, just as an example. So any questions about these two problems? One is with the extended freeway segment, and the other one using a specific grade. One of them, the flow exceeded the break point, and the other one, it didn't. So I'm trying to give you a kind of a range of problem types and how you go through these calculations for freeway segments. Okay. I've got one more problem here just to kind of emphasize things. It's one of the practice problems with the blanks in it. And so I'm just going to go through this one real quick. And that will end it for today. I'm not going to be assigning the homework for this chapter until, I'm going to have to double check here. Let me see. I'm going to assign it. Yeah, not until Tuesday next week. So, I mean, if you want to, you know, check out these problems, it's good, but I want to assign the homework on Tuesday because I will have gone over the multi-lane highway section, which is, there's differences, and it's important to go over that. So let's just go with this one. Northbound freeway segment is on a 4% upgrade, and it gives you stations from station 430 plus 60 to 397 plus 60. So that looks like what? Looks like about 3,300 feet, right? Between 430 plus 60 to 397 plus 60. You're kind of moving it backwards, but that's 33 stations, so that's 3,300 feet. And it has 3 11-foot lanes, a 5-foot right shoulder, and a ramp density of one per mile, in the 3 miles before and the 3 and after the midpoint. So basically, they just gave you the ramp density. You didn't even have to calculate it. They just told you that. They didn't tell you how many or whatever. They just said it's 1. The peak hour factor is 0.9. They gave that to you instead of you having to calculate it. And the northbound traffic during the peak hour is 2,400 vehicles with 20% heavy vehicles. And it's a 50-50 split between single unit and tractor trailer. Determine the density and level of service of the freeway segment. So let's start. So the first thing we got to do is apply equation 6.6. And so we go to the tables, and what do we find? We find that because they're 11-foot lanes, our lane width factor has to be 1.9. And because of the clearance of 5 feet, the factor there is 0.4. And so we apply those two factors into equation 6.6, and then they put in 1 here for the total ramp density because they gave that to you, and you do all that calculations, you end up with a free flow speed of 69.9 miles per hour. Okay. So if you're gonna now we got to figure out the analysis flow rate. So you begin by saying how many feet is the segment, and it's 3,300 feet, which we talked about because of the station 430 plus 60 minus 397 plus 60. And so what does that mean? If it's 3,300 feet, you divide that by 5,280, that's 0.625 miles segments. And it's on an upgrade that exceeds 3%. It's a 4% upgrade. And so and it's longer than a quarter mile. So you can't use extended segment analysis. You have to look it up in the tables. So you use table 6.7 because that's the 50% SUT versus TT, or the single unit versus tractor trailer, with 20% heavy vehicles and a section length of 6.625. What happens here is that you have a grade of 3.5 in the table and you have a grade of 4.5 in the table. So you look up, in one of them, the factor is 2.42, the other one's 2.62. So pretty easy interpolation there, because the grade we're looking for is 4.0, 4% grade. And the table has 3.5 and 4.5. So you just add the 2 and divide by 2, and you end up with 2.52 as your factor. So then you go to equation 6.9, you put in your factor of 2.52 here, and you calculate it, and you end up with 0.767 as your heavy vehicle factor. Now you can get your analysis flow rate. You can use equation 6.7. So you put in your volume, 2,400, which is given, the 0.9, which is the peak hour factor, which was given, the 3 lanes, which is given, and the 0.767, which you just calculated. And you end up with 1159 passenger cars per hour per lane. So now you need to check the breakpoint, right? So what you do is you take the breakpoint equation, you put in your free flow speed, and what do you end up with is 1,204 for the breakpoint. So your flow rate is less than the breakpoint value of 1,204. So your speed will be the free flow speed, because you're less than the breakpoint. You just use the free flow speed, which was calculated up here, 69.9. So that's what we have there. So now you can do your density calculation, because you've got your, we calculated the 1159 is your flow rate, and your free flow speed is 69.9. You end up with 16.6 passenger cars per mile per lane, and that is a level of service B, because it's between 11 and 18, and that 11 is the max for level of service A, and 18 is the max for level of service B. So that's where it falls in. So this is a perfect example of that. Now we've run out of time. I would suggest to all of you, and particularly since we don't have the homework assigned until Tuesday, practice problem 6.2 is also a very good problem to work through. And I'd suggest that you guys take a look at that. I've actually got it up here But in any event, what you can see from this is that in this particular problem, you end up with a flow rate that does exceed your break point. So therefore, you have to go back to equation 6.2 for your speed, and then your density calculation and your ultimate designation for your level of service. So I've kind of thrown a lot at you in this. As I said, this is important stuff. This is really basic to transportation engineering in this chapter. And on Tuesday, when we go over multi-lane highways, you'll see a lot of similarities. Some of the factors are exactly the same for multi-lane highways, but there are definitely some differences in the analysis between the two. And so we'll go through it, and then I'll be able to assign the homework. And I think a week from today, I'm going to be working on this over the weekend, a group assignment that's going to be related to chapter 6 and these capacity calculations for freeways and or multi-lane highways from a week from today. So with that, that's it for today. If there's any questions, let me know. And the question that just got asked in chat, the answer is yes. And so anyway, everybody have a great weekend. Go Aztecs. I hope we come back on Tuesday with the Aztecs still in the tournament with 2 wins under their belt. Okay. Take care, everybody. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you on Tuesday.
Professor? I had a question regarding the homework.